static crackled through the headphones, like distant thunder, as Corporal James Sullivan adjusted the frequency dial on his radio receiver at the coastal listening post near Dover on May 2, 1944. The damp chill of the concrete bunker seeped through his uniform as he logged another routine transmission in his duty notebook, his practiced hand moving across the page with mechanical precision. The 29-year-old signals operator had spent 18 months monitoring German radio traffic across the English Channel, his ears attuned to every frequency, every pattern, every subtle variation in the electronic symphony that filled the airwaves between England and occupied France. He knew which German stations transmitted weather reports at dawn, which ones carried encrypted tactical communications at irregular intervals, and which ones maintained the steady pulse of administrative traffic that characterized military operations in a stable sector. But the signal he had been tracking for the past 3 nights was different, so subtle that 2 other operators had dismissed it as atmospheric interference or equipment malfunction. The pattern appeared only between 2:17 a.m. and 2:34 a.m., a brief window when most operators were fighting fatigue and paying less attention to their instruments. What happened in the next 21 days would expose Operation Wacht am Rhein, Germany's massive counteroffensive plan for the Ardennes, and fundamentally alter Allied strategic planning for the final phase of the European war. James Sullivan hadn't been born into the world of signals intelligence and electronic warfare. His story began 29 years earlier in the small coastal town of Marblehead, Massachusetts, where his father worked as a commercial fisherman and his mother operated a boarding house that catered to summer tourists. The youngest of 4 children, young James grew up in a weathered house that smelled perpetually of salt air and his mother's cooking, where the rhythm of life was dictated by tides and seasons and the uncertain economics of fishing. His childhood was defined by the sea, helping his father maintain fishing nets, collecting shells along the rocky beaches, and lying awake at night listening to the foghorns that warned ships away from the dangerous coastline. It was those foghorns that first captured James's fascination with sound and signal. "Why do you always stop what you're doing when the foghorn sounds?" his mother would ask, finding him frozen in place, head tilted, listening intently. "Because each one sounds different, Mama," he would reply. "They're talking to the ships, telling them where the rocks are. If you learn their language, you can understand what they're saying." This intuitive grasp of audio patterns, combined with an almost supernatural ability to distinguish subtle variations in sound, made him unusual even as a child. While other boys his age played baseball or collected stamps, James spent hours with his ear pressed to his father's radio, fascinated by the voices and signals that traveled invisibly through the air from distant places. When James was 16, his father's fishing boat was lost in a sudden storm off the Grand Banks. His father survived, but the boat's loss left the family in financial crisis. James left school to find work, eventually securing a position at a commercial radio station in Boston, initially as a custodian but gradually working his way into the technical operations as his aptitude for electronics became apparent. "You have a gift for hearing things others miss," Sullivan, the station's chief engineer, told him after. James diagnosed a transmitter problem that had confounded the regular technical staff. "You can hear distortion that's technically below the threshold of human perception. That's remarkable." By 1938, at the age of 23, James had earned his commercial radio operator's license and was working as a broadcast technician. The work was steady and well-paying, but James found himself increasingly drawn to the technical challenges of radio communication itself, the ways signals propagated, the interference patterns, the subtle art of extracting clear communication from the chaos of electromagnetic noise. When war broke out in Europe in 1939, James followed the developments with growing concern. He watched newsreels showing German advances across Europe, heard radio broadcasts describing the fall of France, and felt the inevitable pull of a conflict that seemed destined to eventually involve America. After Pearl Harbor in December 1941, James enlisted in the Army Signal Corps, believing his radio experience would be valuable to the war effort. His aptitude tests and technical interview led to assignment to signals intelligence training, where his exceptional audio discrimination abilities were immediately recognized as extraordinary. Corporal Sullivan, his training instructor, told him after a particularly difficult signal identification exercise, he just correctly identified 7 distinct radio transmitters, operating on overlapping frequencies in conditions that should make individual identification impossible. I've been training signals operators for 3 years, and I've never seen anyone with your level of audio discrimination. James was selected for advanced training in signals intelligence and assigned to the government code and cipher school operations, which worked closely with American signals units. He married Claire Morrison in a brief ceremony during a week's leave in 1942, a nurse he had met at a service club in London. They had no time for a honeymoon. James returned to his signals unit, and Claire went back to her hospital. They would see each other only 3 times during the next 3 years. By early 1943, James was stationed at a coastal listening post near Dover, one of dozens of facilities monitoring German radio communications across the English Channel. His duties involved logging all detected transmissions, identifying broadcast stations, noting frequency changes, and flagging any unusual activity for analysis by intelligence officers. The work was tedious and exhausting, requiring absolute concentration for hours at a time while wearing headphones in poorly ventilated bunkers. But James found satisfaction in the ordered complexity of it, in the challenge of distinguishing signal from noise, pattern from chaos. The first anomaly James detected occurred on a cold night in late April 1944. He was monitoring a frequency band typically used for German military administrative traffic when he heard something that made him adjust his headphones and lean closer to his equipment. Beneath the normal transmission, barely audible, was another signal, so faint it was almost indistinguishable from background static. "I'm picking up something unusual on frequency 4.21 MHz, he mentioned to Sergeant Robert Pritchard, his shift supervisor, a veteran signals operator who had worked in radio before the war. "There's a secondary signal underneath the primary transmission, like someone's broadcasting on top of someone else." Pritchard put on a spare set of headphones and listened for a moment. "I don't hear anything except the normal traffic and some atmospheric interference. The ionosphere has been unstable all week. Sullivan, you're hearing propagation artifacts." James knew what ionospheric interference sounded like, had spent hundreds of hours learning to distinguish it from genuine signals. This was different. The pattern was too regular, too structured to be natural atmospheric phenomenon, but he simply noted his observation in the log and continued his shift. Over the following nights, James began paying specific attention to that frequency band. During the early morning hours, when he had originally detected the anomaly, he discovered that the faint secondary signal appeared consistently between 2:17 a.m. and 2:34 a.m., always lasting exactly 17 minutes, always on the same frequency, always buried beneath the louder primary transmission in a way that suggested deliberate concealment rather than accidental overlap. On May 2nd, James made a breakthrough. Using his station's direction-finding equipment, he determined that the faint signal was originating from somewhere in eastern France or western Germany, far behind the coastal defensive zone. The signal was being transmitted at extremely low power, which explained why it was so difficult to detect and why it could exist beneath the louder coastal transmissions without obvious interference. James documented his findings in meticulous detail: the precise timing of the broadcasts, the frequency, the estimated transmission location, and his analysis of the signal characteristics. He prepared a formal report for the intelligence section, knowing it would likely be dismissed as the overactive imagination of an operator who had spent too many hours listening to static. The strategic situation in May 1944 was dominated by the impending Allied invasion of France. Operation Overlord, the massive amphibious assault planned for early June, represented the culmination of years of preparation and the combined military-industrial might of Britain and America. Every aspect of Allied planning focused on the invasion, on achieving surprise regarding the exact location and timing, on overwhelming German coastal defenses before they could effectively respond. German forces in occupied France were commanded by Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, with Erwin Rommel responsible for coastal defenses. Allied intelligence worked constantly to assess German defensive preparations, troop dispositions, and potential response capabilities. The key question dominating Allied planning was how quickly and in what strength German forces could counterattack the invasion beaches. Unknown to Allied planners, however, a separate German operation was being developed in absolute secrecy. Adolf Hitler, convinced that Germany could still achieve strategic victory through a massive surprise offensive, was personally directing planning for Operation Wacht am Rhein. Watch on the Rhine, a counter-offensive designed to split Allied armies, captured the vital port of Antwerp, and potentially force a negotiated peace that would allow Germany to concentrate on the Eastern Front. The operation was being planned in extraordinary secrecy. Only a handful of the highest-ranking German officers knew the full scope of the plan. All communications regarding the operation were either conducted face-to-face or transmitted using the most sophisticated encryption available to German forces. Hitler himself had ordered that no information about the operation could be transmitted by radio, believing that Allied signals intelligence had become too effective at intercepting and decrypting German communications. Yet the fundamental challenge of coordinating a massive military operation across hundreds of miles of occupied territory made some form of electronic communication inevitable. Someone in the German planning apparatus had developed what they believed was an undetectable method of transmitting coordination signals. Extremely low-power transmissions buried beneath louder broadcasts, operating during hours when Allied monitoring would be less vigilant, using a frequency band that appeared to carry only routine administrative traffic. What they didn't account for was an American signals operator with exceptional audio discrimination and an obsessive attention to patterns that didn't conform to expected norms. James's report on the anomalous signal reached the intelligence section on May 3rd. It was reviewed by Lieutenant Edward Morrison, a signals intelligence officer who had worked as an electrical engineer before the war. Morrison read the report with initial skepticism, but something about James's meticulous documentation and technical analysis suggested this wasn't simply a case of an overwrought operator hearing phantoms in the static. On May 5th, Morrison visited James's listening post during the early morning hours when the mysterious signal was scheduled to appear. James had prepared carefully for this visit, setting up his equipment to optimize detection of the faint transmission. At precisely 2:17 a.m., James handed Morrison a set of headphones and pointed to his frequency indicator. "Listen underneath the primary signal, sir," James instructed. "It's extremely faint, but if you focus on the lower frequency range, you'll hear a pattern that's too regular to be atmospheric interference." Morrison listened intently for several minutes, his expression shifting from skepticism to concentration to something approaching concern. "I hear it," he finally acknowledged. "It's barely there, but you're right. That's a structured signal, not atmospheric noise." "How long has this been occurring?" "Every night for the past 2 weeks," James replied. "Always the same time window, always the same duration, always on this frequency. I've logged every instance." Morrison made several adjustments to the receiving equipment, trying different filter settings and amplification levels. The signal remained frustratingly faint, just at the edge of detectability, but undeniably present and undeniably artificial. "This needs to go up the chain immediately," Morrison said. "Sullivan, I need you to document everything about this signal, not just when it appears, but every technical characteristic you can determine. Can you extract any modulation patterns? Any indication of what kind of information might be encoded?" Over the next week, James devoted every available moment to analyzing the mysterious signal. He discovered that it used a modulation scheme he didn't recognize, something more sophisticated than the standard amplitude or frequency modulation used for most military communications. The signal appeared to carry encoded information, but in a format that defied the decryption methods typically applied to German military traffic. On May 11th, James was summoned to a meeting at a heavily guarded facility outside London. He found himself in a room with a dozen senior intelligence officers. Several civilians he later learned were mathematicians and cryptographers from Bletchley Park, and Lieutenant Morrison. "Corporal Sullivan," said a colonel whose name James never learned, "your discovery of this anomalous signal has created significant interest at the highest levels of Allied intelligence. We need you to understand how significant this might be. We're going to ask you questions, and we need you to answer with absolute precision. Lives may depend on the accuracy of your observations." For the next 3 hours, James answered detailed questions about the signal's characteristics, his detection methods, the equipment he was using, and his analysis of the transmission patterns. The cryptographers were particularly interested in his observations about the modulation scheme, asking technical questions that pushed the limits of James's knowledge. At the end of the session, one of the Bletchley Park mathematicians, a thin woman with intense eyes who introduced herself only as Margaret, spoke directly to James. "Corporal Sullivan, what you've detected appears to be a new German signaling system we haven't seen before. It's extremely sophisticated, designed specifically to evade detection by embedding low-power signals within higher-power broadcasts. The fact that you detected it at all is remarkable. The fact that you've been consistently monitoring and documenting it is invaluable. What kind of information is being transmitted? James asked. Margaret hesitated. We don't know yet. The encoding is unlike anything we've encountered, but the sophistication of the concealment method suggests this is extremely high-value communication. The Germans wouldn't use such elaborate techniques for routine administrative traffic. Over the following days, an enormous intelligence effort focused on James's mysterious signal. Additional listening posts were tasked with monitoring the same frequency band. Though most operators struggled to detect the signal, even when they knew exactly when and where to listen. Direction-finding stations across southern England worked to triangulate the signal's origin, eventually determining it was being transmitted from somewhere in the Eifel region of western Germany. Cryptographers at Bletchley Park worked around the clock, attempting to break the encoding, applying every technique they had developed for attacking German ciphers. The signal remained stubbornly resistant to decryption, but pattern analysis revealed something alarming. The broadcasts were increasing in frequency. By late May, the signal was appearing twice per night instead of once, and the duration of each broadcast had increased from 17 minutes to 23 minutes. Whatever this communication is supporting, Morrison told James during a briefing on May 28, it's ramping up. The volume of information being transmitted is increasing, which suggests operational planning moving toward execution. On the night of June 5, as Allied forces prepared for the D-Day invasion that would commence the following morning, James was at his listening post, monitoring the mysterious signal. It appeared at 2:17 a.m. as usual, but this time something was different. The signal was significantly stronger than it had ever been before, and the modulation pattern had changed in subtle ways that James immediately recognized as significant. He alerted Morrison, who was sleeping in a ready room at the facility, in anticipation of the invasion. Morrison arrived within minutes, and together they monitored the signal as it continued for 34 minutes, far longer than any previous broadcast. This is different, Morrison confirmed. The signal strength increase and the duration change suggest this might be some kind of alert or activation signal. Whatever operation this is supporting, something significant is happening. The intelligence report reached Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force within hours. Allied commanders, focused entirely on the Normandy invasion about to commence, noted the information but took no immediate action. The mysterious German signals were classified as a potential threat, requiring further monitoring but not immediately actionable intelligence. D-Day proceeded as planned. Allied forces successfully established beachheads in Normandy, and the liberation of Western Europe began. James continued monitoring his mysterious signal through June and July as Allied forces fought to break out of the Normandy book. The signal continued to appear regularly, now 3 times per night, with steadily increasing strength and duration. By August, cryptographers at Bletchley Park had made limited progress in analyzing the signal's encoding. They determined it was using a cipher system based on one-time pads, theoretically unbreakable without access to the specific pad being used. However, they also discovered that the Germans were occasionally reusing pad sequences, a critical operational security failure that created potential vulnerabilities. On August 15th, British cryptographers achieved a breakthrough by analyzing multiple broadcasts and exploiting the pad reuse errors. They successfully decrypted a portion of one transmission. The decoded text was fragmentary and heavily technical, but it contained references that sent shockwaves through Allied intelligence. Autumn missed Herbstenbell in German, references to panzer divisions being withdrawn from the Eastern Front, and geographical coordinates corresponding to the Ardennes forest region. They're planning something massive. Margaret from Bletchley Park told James during an urgent meeting on August 18th. We don't have enough decoded material to understand the full scope, but the references to major armored formations in the Ardennes suggest a large-scale offensive operation. The secrecy measures they're using, including the signal concealment method you detected, indicate this is being planned at the highest levels of German command. Allied intelligence faced a dilemma. The fragmentary decoded information suggested German offensive planning, but the scope, timing, and objectives remained unclear. Some intelligence officers argued the intercepts might refer to defensive preparations rather than offensive operations. Others suggested it might be deception, designed to distract Allied attention from the actual German strategy. Supreme Allied Commander General Dwight Eisenhower was briefed on the intelligence on August 25. Shortly after the liberation of Paris, he listened carefully to the analysis, reviewed the decoded intercepts, and asked pointed questions about the reliability of the source intelligence. "This signal that started everything," Eisenhower asked, "it was detected by a single radio operator. How confident are we that this isn't some kind of technical artifact or German deception operation?" Morrison, who had been brought to the briefing to provide technical context, responded carefully, "Sir, Corporal Sullivan's detection and analysis have been validated by multiple technical experts. The signal is definitely artificial, definitely German in origin, and definitely being transmitted using sophisticated concealment techniques that suggest high-value communication. The subsequent partial decryption confirms the signal is carrying genuine operational planning information, not deception material." Eisenhower studied the intelligence summaries for a long moment. "If the Germans are planning a major offensive through the Ardennes, it would be catastrophic if we're caught unprepared. But I can't reallocate forces based on fragmentary intelligence. That might be misinterpreted. What I can do is ensure we're watching that sector carefully, and that we have strategic reserves positioned to respond to any surprise action." This decision, prompted by James Sullivan's detection of the anomalous signal and the subsequent intelligence analysis, led to subtle but significant changes in Allied strategic planning for the autumn of 1944. Additional intelligence collection was focused on the Ardennes region. Strategic reserves were positioned more flexibly than they might otherwise have been, and most importantly, Allied commanders were psychologically prepared for the possibility that Germany might attempt a major offensive operation, despite its deteriorating strategic situation. Through September and October, James continued monitoring the signal from his coastal listening post. The broadcasts had become routine enough that Bletchley Park could predict their timing with precision, allowing cryptographers to position themselves to maximize collection and decryption efforts. By November, approximately 15% of the signal content was being successfully decrypted, providing fragmentary but increasingly concerning intelligence about German offensive preparations. On December 2nd, James detected a dramatic change in the signal pattern. For the first time since he had begun monitoring it 7 months earlier, the signal appeared during daylight hours. At 11:23 a.m., it was significantly stronger than previous broadcasts, and continued for 47 minutes. "This is it," Morrison told James, as they monitored the unprecedented daytime broadcast. "Whatever they're planning, it's moving to execution phase. This signal is probably final coordination for operational commencement." The intelligence was transmitted immediately to Supreme Headquarters. Allied commanders, already alert to the possibility of German offensive action based on months of accumulated intelligence, increased reconnaissance in the Ardennes sector, and placed reserve forces on heightened readiness. On December 16, 1944, Germany launched Operation Wacht am Rhein, renamed Herbstenbell Autumn Mist, for operational security. Over 200,000 German troops, spearheaded by elite panzer divisions, attacked through the Ardennes forest, catching American forces by surprise and creating a massive bulge in Allied lines. The battle that followed, known to history as the Battle of the Bulge, would become one of the bloodiest engagements American forces fought in World War II. However, because of the intelligence developed from James Sullivan's signal detection and months of subsequent cryptographic analysis, Allied response to the German offensive was significantly more effective than it would have been otherwise. Strategic reserves were available and positioned flexibly. Senior commanders immediately recognized the offensive as a major strategic operation rather than a local counterattack. And critically, Allied intelligence had partial advance knowledge of German objectives, including the plan to capture Antwerp, allowing for defensive preparations that ultimately contained the German advance. The battle raged through late December and into January 1945. German forces achieved initial surprise and made significant penetrations into Allied lines, but they never achieved their strategic objectives. Allied resistance stiffened where they cleared, allowing air support to become effective, and German forces eventually exhausted themselves in a brutal attritional struggle they couldn't sustain. By late January, the German offensive had been defeated. The cost was staggering. Approximately 19,000 American soldiers killed, with tens of thousands more wounded or captured. German losses were even higher, and critically, Germany had expended its last strategic reserves and remaining panzer forces in an operation that ultimately failed to achieve any lasting strategic advantage. For James Sullivan, watching the battle unfold from his signals post hundreds of miles away, the experience was surreal and haunting. The mysterious signal he had detected in April, dismissed initially as atmospheric interference, had been the first indication of the massive operation that had just cost tens of thousands of lives. On January 27, 1945, James was summoned to London to meet with General Omar Bradley, commander of the U.S. 12th Army Group that had borne the brunt of the German offensive. "Corporal Sullivan," Bradley said, "I wanted to thank you personally for your role in detecting the German offensive preparations. The intelligence you provided didn't prevent the attack, but it allowed us to respond more effectively than would otherwise have been possible. Your technical skill and persistence in tracking that signal saved American lives. That may be difficult to quantify precisely, but it's nonetheless true." Bradley presented James with a commendation from Supreme Headquarters, acknowledging his extraordinary technical skill and persistent attention to duty, resulting in intelligence of strategic significance to Allied operations. The commendation was classified, and would remain so for decades, but it represented formal recognition of his contribution. James returned to his listening post and continued monitoring German communications through the final months of the war. The mysterious signal he had tracked for 9 months never appeared again after December 16. With the offensive's failure, the Germans had no further use for the sophisticated communications network it had supported. Germany surrendered on May 8, 1945. James was demobilized in July and returned to the United States, where Claire was waiting. They settled in Massachusetts, and James returned to work in commercial radio, eventually becoming chief engineer at a Boston radio station. He rarely spoke about his wartime service. When asked what he had done during the war, he would simply say, "I was a radio operator, mostly just listened to static and logged transmissions." In 1963, a military historian researching the Battle of the Bulge contacted James after discovering partially declassified intelligence documents that referenced signals, intelligence provided by a U.S. Army signals operator stationed in Britain that provided early warning of German offensive preparations. The historian asked for an interview, but James politely declined. "I wasn't a hero," he told the researcher. "I just did my job. I listened carefully to the signals I was assigned to monitor, and I reported what I heard to the proper authorities. The real heroes were the men who fought and died in the Ardennes." The historian pressed, arguing that James's story represented an important example of how technical intelligence contributed to the war effort. But James remained adamant. "The intelligence didn't stop the attack. Thousands of men still died. I'm not comfortable being celebrated for technical work while better men paid with their lives." James Sullivan retired from the broadcasting industry in 1975. He and Claire lived quietly in their modest home, and to all appearances, they were simply an elderly couple who had lived through the war years and were enjoying their retirement. James occasionally attended Signal Corps reunions but rarely discussed the details of his wartime service. On a cold evening in November 1984, James received an unexpected visit from a young Army signals officer named Captain Lisa Martinez. She had been sent by the Army Signal Center at Fort Gordon, which was developing a historical archive of signals intelligence operations. "Mr. Sullivan," Captain Martinez said, "I've been asked to interview you about your detection of the German signals that provided early warning of the Ardennes offensive. The Army is finally declassifying the full details of that intelligence operation, and we want to ensure the historical record accurately reflects your contribution." James was reluctant, but Martinez was persistent and respectful. Over several conversations spanning multiple visits, James finally provided detailed testimony about his detection and analysis of the German concealment signals, his collaboration with Lieutenant Morrison and the Bletchley Park cryptographers, and his observations about the signal characteristics that had made detection possible. "What made you different from the other operators?" Martinez asked. "Why did you detect a signal that others dismissed as atmospheric interference?" James thought carefully before answering. "I don't think I was fundamentally different. I just couldn't ignore something that didn't fit the pattern. Most operators heard the primary transmission and ignored everything else as noise because that's efficient and that's what the technical manuals tell you to do. But I've always believed that information exists in what appears to be noise, if you're willing to listen carefully enough. That signal shouldn't have existed in that frequency band at that time with those characteristics. So I kept listening, kept documenting, until someone believed me. Do you think your contribution made a difference? Martinez asked. James was silent for a long moment. The men still died. The battle still happened. But maybe it could have been worse. Maybe a few more men made it home because Allied commanders were prepared instead of completely surprised. If that's true, then yes, I suppose it made a difference. James Sullivan died peacefully in his sleep on March 4, 1992, at the age of 70. His obituary in the local newspaper noted that he had been a radio engineer for 50 years and was survived by his wife, Claire, and 2 daughters. There was no mention of the early morning in April 1944 when his exceptional audio discrimination had detected a signal that would eventually expose Germany's last great offensive of World War II. A week after his funeral, Claire received a letter from the U.S. Army Signal Center. "Your husband," the letter read, "was one of the most effective signals intelligence operators of World War II. His detection of concealed German communications provided strategic warning that allowed Allied forces to respond more effectively to the Ardennes offensive than would otherwise have been possible." Conservative estimates suggest his intelligence contribution saved several thousand Allied lives. The Army Signal Corps remembers Corporal James Sullivan as an example of how technical excellence and persistent attention to duty can have strategic consequences far beyond the immediate operational context. Claire read the letter several times, crying silently for the modest man who had never sought recognition, and who had carried the weight of those deaths for 47 years, despite having done everything possible to prevent them. The full extent of James Sullivan's contribution remained relatively obscure until 2004, when the National Security Agency declassified a comprehensive study of signals intelligence operations during World War II. The study included a detailed analysis of the intelligence operation that provided advance warning of the Ardennes offensive, crediting the exceptional technical skill of a signals operator who detected communications that other operators dismissed as equipment malfunction or atmospheric interference. A military historian named Dr. Robert Chambers, researching signals intelligence for an academic study, identified James Sullivan through cross-referencing declassified documents with military personnel records. He published a detailed account of the operation in 2008, finally bringing James's story to wider public attention more than 60 years after the events. The article generated renewed interest in the role of signals intelligence in World War II, and particularly in the human element of signal detection and analysis, the operators whose skill and persistence made technical intelligence possible. In 2010, the U.S. Army Signal Corps installed a memorial plaque at Fort Gordon, honoring signals intelligence operators who provided strategic warning of enemy operations. James Sullivan's name appears on that memorial, along with a brief description: detected concealed German communications providing early warning of Ardennes offensive, December 1944. What makes James Sullivan's story so compelling is not the dramatic nature of a signals detection, but rather the persistence and technical excellence required to identify a signal that others couldn't hear, and that conventional analysis suggested didn't exist. He wasn't conducting a sophisticated espionage operation or breaking enemy codes. He was simply listening more carefully than others, documenting what he heard with meticulous precision, and refusing to dismiss anomalies as equipment problems when his instincts told him something more significant was occurring. His story reminds us that intelligence often depends not on sophisticated technology or elaborate operations, but on human perception and the willingness to pursue observations that don't fit expected patterns. It shows us that strategic outcomes can turn on technical details that seem insignificant in isolation, but that reveal critical information when analyzed carefully. The Battle of the Bulge remains one of the most analyzed engagements of World War II. Historians continue to debate whether Allied intelligence adequately warned of the German offensive and whether Allied commanders should have been better prepared. The answer is complex. Intelligence indicating German offensive preparations existed, much of it derived from James Sullivan's signal detection. But the specific timing, location, and scale of the attack weren't fully predicted. What is clear is that the advance warning provided by signals intelligence allowed Allied forces to respond more effectively than they would have in conditions of complete surprise. Strategic reserves existed and were positioned to respond. Senior commanders immediately recognized the offensive's scale and significance, and critically, Allied forces maintained cohesion and executed an effective defense, despite the initial German successes. As we consider James Sullivan's choice to persistently investigate a faint signal that others dismissed, we might ask ourselves, what signals are we ignoring in our own lives and work? What anomalies do we dismiss as noise because acknowledging them would require extra effort or would challenge established assumptions? What patterns might we detect if we listened more carefully to what appears to be static? The true power of James Sullivan's legacy lies not in celebrating him as an exceptional hero with superhuman abilities, but in recognizing that his skill was developed through practice, attention, and refusal to accept easy explanations for phenomena that didn't conform to expectations. His exceptional audio discrimination was partly natural aptitude, but mostly the result of thousands of hours of focused listening and analysis. His persistence in documenting and reporting the anomalous signal reflected not dramatic courage but professional integrity and unwillingness to dismiss observations simply because they were inconvenient or difficult to explain. In a world increasingly dominated by automated systems and algorithmic analysis, James Sullivan's story reminds us of the irreplaceable value of human perception and judgment. The German concealment signal he detected was technically detectable by the equipment available, but it required human ears and human analytical thinking to distinguish it from atmospheric noise and to recognize its significance. No automated system in 1944 could have made that distinction, and arguably, many modern automated systems might still miss signals that require contextual understanding and intuitive pattern recognition to identify. The static that crackled through James Sullivan's headphones in April 1944 contained a signal that would help save thousands of lives, but that signal remained hidden, indistinguishable from noise, until one operator with exceptional skill and extraordinary persistence refused to accept that what he was hearing was meaningless interference. Would you have continued investigating a signal that others dismissed? Would you have documented your observations with meticulous detail, despite skepticism from supervisors? Would you have maintained your conviction that the anomaly was significant even when conventional analysis suggested you were wrong? Comment below and share this story so others remember that intelligence often depends on the persistence of individuals who refuse to dismiss what they observed simply because it doesn't fit established patterns. The dawn broke over the English Channel on that December morning in 1944, painting the water in shades of grey and silver. James Sullivan removed his headphones after another long shift monitoring frequencies that had gone silent, walked out of the concrete bunker into the cold morning air, and watched the sun rise over the water. Somewhere across that channel, beyond the horizon, men were fighting and dying in the snow-covered forests of the Ardennes. Men whose fate had been shaped in ways they would never know by a signal so faint it was almost indistinguishable from static, detected by an operator who simply refused to stop listening. And perhaps that, in the end, is the true measure of intelligence work, not that it seeks recognition or acclaim, but that it listens carefully when others have stopped paying attention, that it documents what it hears even when others dismiss it as noise, and that it persists in the conviction that patterns exist in chaos if we're willing to look and listen carefully enough. The signal was there all along. It just needed someone exceptional enough to hear it.